You know, it seems only yesterday when we were swept up in the exhilaration of the Arab Spring, and we reported on it night after night after night. You might recall we'd make contact right in the square in Cairo where the whole momentum was building. And we reported from the other venues where the Arab Spring seemed to be transforming the world very much for the better. Okay, it was 5 years ago, and we saw the ousting of totalitarian regimes in Egypt and Tunisia, Libya, Yemen, and the promise of new civil societies in those countries. But it seems that we've seen a return to authoritarianism, just in a different guise. And as I was suggesting last night, sometimes the cure seems almost as bad as the disease. My next guest argues that the EU, as a major player in the region, could have done much more to shore up democracy and ensure lasting change, but it missed the opportunity to do so. Andrea Teti is the Director, Centre for Global Security and Governance at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And he's sitting in the Sydney studio. I'm not there with him tonight, but I welcome him. It's good to have you on the program, Andrea.
Good to be here, thank you.
Is the spring officially dead?
Well, if by spring you mean the possibility of a transformation soon of Middle Eastern countries towards democracies, then yes. But if you mean by the Arab Uprisings or the Arab Spring, the mass movement, the engagement of millions of people across the region, their struggle towards a better life, against authoritarianism, for social justice, then that's still very much on.
You wrote recently one of the Arab Uprising best-known slogans was bread, freedom, social justice. And that reminds us that we were talking about opposition not just to repressive security states, but on a raft of human rights issues.
Absolutely. You can look across, you could pick up the UN Declaration on the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, and pretty much every human right that's in there has been the subject of repression. I mean, of course, democracy is built on a combination of human rights: civil, political, social, and economic. And along the entire line, those human rights have been under attack in Middle Eastern regimes across the region.
You did write recently and quite emphatically that the Arab Spring was dead. Quote, the uprisings that began in Tunisia, December 2010, spread throughout most of the Arab world, were a dream, a beautiful dream, but a dream that has crashed onto the hard rocks of reality. Now you hint that there's some good news buried in all this catastrophe.
Well, I think we need to think about two different levels. If we think about the governmental level, right, who's in government, what is the international environment regionally and globally within which the Arab uprisings took place, and how has that changed? Then the answer has to be not much. We do see authoritarian regimes in place in pretty much every country in which the uprisings took place, from the Yemen and Bahrain all the way to through Egypt and Tunisia is our best hope. But even there, we can see democracy or fledgling democracy under attack. So I think at that governmental level, we have to acknowledge that the dream did not succeed. But if we think about the conditions, I think this is important, if we think about the conditions that motivated the uprisings in the first place, why were people across the region frustrated, their everyday lives, politically, socially, economically, then those conditions haven't changed. And we see, again across the region, albeit in different forms, I'm thinking particularly about Tunisia and Egypt, we see examples of protests rearing their heads again, organizing against exactly the same kinds of issues that were motivating people to come into the squares across the region in December 2010 and January 2011. So I think on the one hand, there's a semblance of stability. These authoritarian regimes are back, some of them worse than before. On the other hand, there's also a feeling, I think, amongst the keener observers that the situation can't continue. There needs to be another solution than the one that we have at the moment, which is simply authoritarianism communism redux, as it were.
The Arab Spring wasn't the only wonderful moment. At the time of glasnost and perestroika, when that wall dividing the Germanys came down, we all hoped, and certainly the people of the then Soviet certainly hoped, that they would have a great spring. But pretty soon what we saw was increasing income and wealth polarisation driven by kleptocratic elites. Now, you will recognise that I've pinched your phrase, because exactly the same thing has happened in so many of these places. Money, everything's stolen by the kleptocratic elites.
Absolutely. I mean, most of your listeners will be familiar with Thomas Piketty's French economist and his team. They put out a book recently called Capital, in which they make precisely the claim that across the world we see a polarization of income and a polarization of wealth. In other words, the rich are getting richer and the poor, if they're getting richer, they're not getting as rich as fast as the 1%, as it were. And the story is no different in the Middle East. And so I think the two elements in what you just said that are really, really important. On the one hand, the similarity of the struggles between and the conditions that people face in the Middle East and Europe and other Western countries, that's a little bit counterintuitive, because we're used to thinking of liberal democracies, established liberal democracies in the West, North America, Europe, and Australia, of course, primarily, as being somehow inherently different from places in the Middle East. And that's certainly true when it comes to the authoritarian nature of police repression in those Arab countries. But there are similarities, and those similarities have to do with the way in which social and economic conditions have been changing in the last at least 4 decades, and for the worse. And for the worse, certainly for people in the Middle East, but also for people in my native Europe, for example. So that's one part of the story. The other thing that I wanted to pick up on what you said was the reference to 1989. And in the early days of the uprisings, a lot of optimists were saying, well, this is the Arab world's 1989. And I intuitively was thinking much more about 1848 for two good reasons. One is that the international environment was simply different in 1989. In 2010, 2011, uprisings across the Middle East did not face a favourable international environment, whether at the regional level, we're talking about Saudi Arabia and other Gulf countries that were, and still are, absolutely opposed to any kind of democratic transformation in the rest of the Arab world, or at the international level, where at the very best we could say that countries like the US and organizations like the EU and its member states were lukewarm in their initial responses and ineffective in their long-term responses or medium-term responses. So very much like 1848, we see a very hostile international environment. Now, my suspicion, my caveat, my caution would be simply to say this, that in 1848, the revolutions in Europe failed. Every single one of them did. And they were replaced by restored monarchies that seemed to be very stable for the remainder of the century. And yet, by the end of World War I, the dominant language of global politics is democracy. Remember US President Wilson's famous 14 points. So these transformations can take place if that's the direction in which the basic conditions, the structural conditions, economically, socially, and politically are going. So on the one hand, I'd return to this skepticism about what governments are doing, but on the other hand, I'd keep my eye out for what people across the region and across the world are doing about these challenges to democracy.
You've been very critical of the assistance given by the EU to help build democratic institutions in the Arab Spring countries. Would you elaborate?
Yeah, I mean, I do want to cut my friends in European institutions some slack, because a lot of them have been trying to do a very tough job under very difficult circumstances. I think the long and short of my criticism of the way that the European Union reacted to the Arab uprisings was simply that they claimed that the policies that they learnt from policy mistakes from the past, that supporting authoritarian regimes for short-term security reasons is a bad idea, and that promoting, for example, free trade agreements that didn't take into account social and economic conditions that were part and parcel, in fact, a major player in the polarization of income and wealth that we referred to earlier, that those lessons had been learned. And if you look at the policies that the EU has put out since the uprisings, you can see that actually those policies haven't changed much at all. So those lessons haven't been learned. And quite quickly, if you think about the reaction to the coup that current President Sisi has carried out in Egypt, the European Union also was fairly happy or mutedly happy to support a return to authoritarianism in Egypt. Not that it ever became particularly liberal, for example, under Morsi, but the Muslim Brotherhood elected president. But nonetheless, sorry, go ahead.
No, please.
So they both, in terms of the social and economic sort of policies that they pursued, they didn't change with respect to what came before. And at a political level, they continued to support effectively. They continued to support authoritarian regimes. So that's not going to do the prospects of democratic change any good at all.
Part of the problem, as you see it, is the process of funding. There's some very strange stories you tell about the difficulties in getting decent funding for worthwhile projects.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the European Union does a lot of good things, but some things it's notorious for, and the length of its application, the complications of its application processes for funding, whether you're an academic or whether you're a civil society group, are quite notorious. Now, to be fair to them, they're trying to do something about it, but nonetheless, the problem, at least for the time being, remains. But more importantly than that, I mean, these are technical issues that can be fixed if there's the will to do so. But more importantly than that, there's a problem, which is that often this funding doesn't reach the groups that it's intended, or the kinds of groups that it's intended to reach, because, for example, some of these groups simply aren't applying. They have political objections to the European Union's support to the aforementioned dictators, for example, or they have political objections to Europe or the US's stance on the Palestinian question. Very often they simply object to the impact that other European Union policies have on the country itself, worsening the conditions that we mentioned earlier on, socially, economically, politically. So we have to bear in mind that the European Union's job is not simply to say, well, we have a pot of money, wouldn't it be a good idea for people to apply for it? They have to reach out, and they have to, win the hearts and minds, as it were, of these groups, pro-democracy groups, pro-civil rights groups, pro-social and economic justice groups that have been working for decades under extremely tough conditions. And let them know that these funds, that the European Union is prepared to support them. Now, I have an anecdote that I sometimes tell, which is that I was lucky enough to interview someone who had a post as an outreach officer in one of the European Union delegations in the Arab world, and I asked, what are the ways in which the EU does outreach in these countries? And the answer that I got was, twofold. We do two things. One is we advertise on newspapers, which I thought that's fair enough, although might not be particularly effective. You have to back that up with something else. And the second thing that was mentioned was, receptions at member state embassies. And I don't know whether you get this advert in Australia, but the Ferrero Rocher advert, in which one of the guests says, "Mr. Ambassador, you're spoiling us with these Ferrero Rochers," and the notion that groups that are fighting for social justice at the blunt end of the repression of authoritarian regimes could take time out to dress up in a tux and show up at the embassy of some European member state in an Arab world. The notion that they wouldn't put themselves in the firing line from those regimes' authoritarian repressive apparatuses is, it's one that sort of beggars belief. So I suppose what I'm saying is that the European Union as an organisation, although it puts a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of thought into how it does support for civil society groups, pro-democracy groups around the Arab world, really can shape up its game. It should be shaping up its game, particularly in the light.
To what extent would the EU be concerned about directly or indirectly funding an Islamist group?
Well, that's a very interesting question. I mean, certainly from what I know, there's before 2011 there was a sort of informal red line, a kind of cautionary note against investing in or sending out funds to Islamist groups of any kind, and that red line, as far as I can tell, has returned in the last couple of years. I would caution against that, because I think if we take a close look at Islamist groups, then it's quite clear that there's a great diversity amongst them. And within those groups, there are quite a few who are interested in questions of social justice and are not simply interested in advancing a narrowly religious agenda, but are willing to work with other groups. My particular interest is in Egypt, and I know that over the last 15 years, for example, there have been several parts of even the Muslim Brotherhood that is now ostracized, and the Egyptian government defines it a terrorist organization. But parts of those groups that were, I mean, to my mind, very far from terrorist organizations, were interested in working with trade unions, they were interested in working with liberal groups, they were interested in working with leftist organizations. For what? For issues of social justice, better representation, anti-authoritarianism, and so on. So these are groups that, so to speak, we can do business with, right? So a blanket ban on Islamist organizations receiving funding, formal or informal as it may be, is not a good thing to do, and it's policy-wise, it's not a smart move.
We've only got a couple of minutes left together. The EU, of course, has been emphasising free trade agreements, the familiar argument of the trickle-down effect. Bring trade and investment, wealth will increase, people's lives will improve across the board. How's that been working?
Well, not very well, and not in the Middle East, where Tunisia and Egypt were the poster boys, the poster children, as it were, of the IMF, and received several commendations for how well they were progressing across market liberalizations. And as we discussed earlier on, that produced simply social and economic tensions, income and wealth polarization, and it's not an unfamiliar picture. If we go back to 1989, think about what followed. Think about the shocks that the Baltic states economies, Russia itself, Poland were put through, massive poverty that was generated by these free trade agreements, and in the wake of that, none of the kind of equitable, inclusive growth that was predicted. So it's quite clear that we need a plan B. I mean, there are several plan Bs out there, but we quite clearly need a plan B. And the only thing that I would add to that is that if in the Middle East it's quite clear that regimes over the last 20, 30 years at the very least have been using the form of democracy but emptying it into a shell, so that we have some of the processes of democracy but none of the substance, something similar, in a different way, has been happening in so-called established liberal democracies. I'm thinking particularly about Europe. So there's a crisis of representation, and there's a crisis at a social and economic level. On both counts, those democracies are failing, and this is why we see the rise not just of left-wing movements such as Syriza in Greece and Podemos in Spain, but also of very worrying rightwards shifts in the rest of the European Union. So I would say this, that what the significance of the Arab uprisings is, whether we think that they failed or succeeded, is that they've signposted a crisis of democracy. This emptying of the substantive characteristics, the real elements of democracy into mere form and procedure. That's a challenge that we in the West need also to meet. And I think that if your listeners take nothing else from our conversation, it would be this. How is it that we are addressing that challenge in Australia, in the UK, in other parts of the Western world?
Andrea, thank you very much. That was a splendid performance. Andrea Teti, Director, Centre for Global Security and Governance at the University of Aberdeen in Scotland. And now we wish to investigate in some detail where the tens of thousands of Syrian refugees, well, the 12,000, we promised to welcome, where are they and what are they up to? Are they happy? Is Australia being a good host?